So during January, I was lucky enough to get to go to El Salvador and Costa Rica with the Eden Travel Seminar. And a few of you have asked me how that trip went and what my experience was, and I'm really sorry to say that my answers were pretty bad because that was my first time going internationally, and every second was a brand new experience, and I'm still kind of processing it all. So I hope to, kind of give a little bit of what I experienced here today. One of the really amazing things that struck me was the Salvadoran people and the experience that we had there. The Salvadoran people have a unique devotion to one of their now Catholic saints, Oscar Romero. We attended a service in the National Cathedral there, in the crypt below the actual cathedral where Oscar Romero now lies. And one of the really quite shocking things about the service, it was a Catholic Mass, and I swear Oscar Romero's name was mentioned more than God and more than Jesus. And that was kind of weird to me, knowing what little I know about the Catholic tradition. And so I asked, I was like, is this normal for this? Was this just like a special Sunday that, they were recognizing Oscar Romero, and they were, no, this is every Sunday at this particular Mass. And then the name of the Mass was the Mass, I forget the Spanish name for it, but the translation is the service for the poor, the Mass of the People. And many common people were there, dressed in common clothing, very much in stark contrast to the service that was going on above us in the actual cathedral, where government elite were wearing suits and sharply dressed, and it was a really moving service, even in a language that I couldn't fully understand. You could really see the devotion that these people have for Oscar Romero, and upon reflection, it kind of felt like what it might be like to see the devotion that the early church had to Jesus, to walk along with them and see how devoted they were to someone who is so very devoted to him. And today I want to start with a quote from his that I pulled from one of our readings for the trip. And he says, "Unfortunately, brothers and sisters, we are the product of a spiritualized, individualistic education. We are taught, try to save your soul and don't worry about the rest. We told those who suffered, be patient, heaven will follow, hang on, just wait. No, that is not right. That is not salvation." These words from Oscar Romero came in light of the injustices that sparked his vehement criticism of the ruling elite in El Salvador in the 70s and 80s, who kept the boots of their paramilitary death squads on the necks of the severely poor and marginalized people in the country. The oppression was much more than just a boot to the neck, however, and for his vocal and spiritual leadership in the dissenting movement that called for justice, Romero was assassinated in the middle of Mass in 1980. Romero was just one, however, of the 1,000 people per month that were killed and murdered by the Salvadoran government in 1980. And he was murdered for speaking out in favor of God's people and leading the church of the poor. So it's no wonder that Romero is a Christ-like figure in this community. This movement was nonviolent. It advocated for nothing further than the recognition of the poor as simply human beings, as worth something. The basis of this movement that was championed by Romero and many other Catholic priests and Jesuit priests in the area was based off of the ancient spiritual practice of accompaniment. At its essence, accompaniment is the church giving itself in totality to the cause of the oppressed. This ideal is expressed in many different ways and has been in many different ways over history, but we don't have to look much further than a few miles south of here at Christ Church in Maplewood, who have for over a year now accompanied a man named Alex Garcia and his family in their fight to stay together in the face of a government that would take a father away from his children and send him back to Honduras, which he hasn't called home for over 20 years now. And just across the southern border of Honduras, the Church of the Poor accompanied the Salvadoran people as they fled a regime that would and did murder citizens en masse before giving up the monetary benefits that their political position would give them. In the face of the tyrannical evil, the church could not do much to stem the violence. But what it did do was bear witness to the crimes against the people and do everything within their power to walk with them in the darkness. Our lesson from Jeremiah today does just this and is an example of that witness. It bears witness to negligence and laments the people whose lives are lost as a result of that negligence, whether willful or not. The author of the text begins with a vivid emotional reaction to their witness of the suffering of the people of Israel. Their cry is heard far and wide in the land, but nothing is done. A natural turn for a people of faith would be to ask, where is God? And they do. In the beginning of verse 19, they wonder where the Lord has gone and why God can no longer be found in the temple at Zion. Verse 20 shows us how time goes by and they wait in vain for the Lord to show up. In the midst of all that, we see the author invoke the voice of God, who asks, why have they provoked me to anger with their images and their foreign idols? This offers a potential reason for why God might have vacated the temple and their ritual faith traditions. Earlier in chapter 8, the author offers us valuable insight into why God seems to have disappeared. The author bites into the people of Israel, calling out the religious elite for lying to and ignoring the people, saying, the wise shall be put to shame, they shall be dismayed and taken, since they have rejected the word of the Lord. The author further shames the religious elite who govern the people for treating and hurting people carelessly and acting shamefully while willfully ignoring their suffering. So really, it's no wonder why the author of Jeremiah is so very distressed by what they see before them. Chapter 9, verse 1 highlights this sadness, saying, oh, that my head were a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I might weep day and night for the slain of my poor people. The vivid emotion resembles the pain and the horror that the Church of the Poor in El Salvador must have felt while witnessing to the violence against their Salvadoran siblings. This text highlights what it feels like to be in the midst of the dark night of the soul, where hope seems to have faded beyond all things. But verse 22 in chapter 8 is where I think Jeremiah offers hope for this forsaken people. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then has the health of my poor people not been restored? Gilead was some of the richest and most fertile land that Israel possessed in that time, teeming with the resources that the people needed to survive and thrive. Many readings of this text suppose that the author of Jeremiah is saying that even with all around them in this fertile land, that Israel has moved beyond a point of all hope and reconciliation, and that there is nothing that they can do. When I read it, though, I see opportunity. I read this text as an affirmation that the land is bountiful, and that there are still those with the skills to use those resources to help the poor. So to the author's question, why then has the health of my poor people not been restored? One must suppose the answer to be that the people would rather sit and wait for a miracle, offering thoughts and prayers instead of prayerful repentance and action to those in need. God is putting the responsibility with the people to lift up their marginalized siblings and to stand with them in solidarity. A Salvadoran example of this spirited investment in the community comes in the form of a woman that I met during my time there. Her name was Conchita Mendez, and to give some context to her story, the Salvadoran peace accords that were signed in '92 that ended the war didn't do much to change the impoverished state of the country. Even today, the Salvadoran people live in a state of extreme poverty with very little opportunity for work outside of urban areas. Out into the rural hills, entire communities struggle to make ends meet and sometimes only get water once a week. And water is a huge problem in El Salvador, as the supply is so contaminated that we were warned, even in major cities, not to even brush our teeth with it. Now, Conchita's community is well outside of the capital city and struggles with that same extreme poverty that afflicts the entire Salvadoran people. Water was a particular issue for them, and in 2007, the community struggled for clean and usable water, and so much so that they could not bear to buy bottled water anymore and bring it back. As it happened, Conchita's village was built on the side of a mountain that had a known water source running through it, but there had been no infrastructure to tap that resource. Now, Conchita was no engineer or environmentalist, and was one of the few people in the village that could even read. But she was sparked by God to begin looking for ways to get access to this much-needed resource for her community. She works tirelessly to find ways to begin this new project, and in the beginning of her efforts, she had some very blessed breaks. A wealthy Salvadoran citizen that lived in the city reached out to her and offered up use of the land that he owned in the community on the side of the mountain for a drill and a well to be constructed. She had great success with the necessary fundraising for the project, but where her struggle came from was with the local government. Now again, the peace accords in '92 stemmed the violence, but didn't do much to prevent governmental corruption either, particularly in the local communities. She was fought every step of the way. They wanted to control the water project rather than for it to be a locally led project. And one of the major fights of the Salvadoran people, especially nowadays, is the fight against the privatization of the water supply in their country. And this local government wanted control over it so that they could charge exorbitantly for the use of that resource. Even after getting written permission from the national government to move ahead with their project, the local government still fought it. They went as far as to forge signatures on official documents that said Conchita's permission to move forward had been revoked. And in recounting the experience, Conchita said that they knew she had very little education and figured that she would not be able to notice the difference in the signatures on the paperwork she received, and that the paperwork they forged would go by unnoticed. But she says that God gave her the eyes to see past the deception, and she called them out, threatening legal action, and they finally, after months of fighting her, backed down. She reflected on the entire experience with my group, saying that there were many times of discouragement and doubt, but she consistently found inspiration in her community around her. She knew that God was there in that community, and that with God, she would find a way to make this project a reality. She found the balm in Gilead. She was the physician that led to the well-being of her community through this water project. She stood up to the hypocrisy of the leadership of her town and invested in the people around her in the way that our Jeremiah text calls for, and in the way that our lesson from Matthew does as well. This story is a pretty familiar one for us, but it's much more complex than just a simple pay your taxes type of lesson. The Pharisees, alongside Herodians, who simply put are loyalists to the Roman Empire, plot to entrap Jesus between a rock and a hard place in the story. Pharisees and Herodians really have little in common beyond their dislike of Jesus and his message. The Pharisees are the ones that take the active oppositional voice in the text, and they pose the question with false flattery, saying, "Teacher, we know you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with the truth," and blah, 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 more flattery. Have you ever been brown-nosed by someone? Do you kind of understand how far back Jesus' eyes must have rolled into his head, right? And then they pose the question, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Now again, Jesus sees straight through the flattery and recognizes the trap for what it is. And he meets it with a blunt response. "Why are you testing me, hypocrites? Why are you doing this?" He knows that choosing one answer or the other will result in offense. If he says, yes, it is lawful, he will offend the Pharisees and their followers who are sick of the empire's occupation of their land and interference with their lives. On the other hand, if he says it is unlawful, the loyalist Herodians will run right away to the local powers that be to tell on him. So Jesus simply responds by asking for a denarius, the cost of the Roman tax at the time. This seems like a simple and irrelevant movement in the story, but there's a much deeper layer involved. The inscriptions on the denarius used during the time of Jesus had the face of the emperor, Tiberius Caesar, and the words Pontife Maxime, which signified Caesar's divinity. The coin reveals the Pharisees' hypocrisy right away as they describe the inscription on it, and in one subtle move, Jesus, who walks with empty pockets, reveals their hypocrisy of the Pharisees, who by standing on temple grounds are readily able to produce from their own pockets a coin with a blasphemous inscription on it, despite their claims of being pious men of God, which just highlights how complicit they were in the injustices of the empire. I like to imagine that before delivering the final words on the subject, Jesus took the coin, flipped it around in his hands, and kind of just casually tossed it aside, and then looked back at his challengers and those who were supposedly devoted to God and said, "And you, friend, whose image do you bear? Whose inscription is on you?" For underneath it all, that is the point that Jesus is trying to make here, and the question he is asking to all those who profess to follow God: whose inscription is on you? Are we inscribed with the mark of Caesar, of further oppression and marginalization of the poor in favor of individualism? If so, let us give ourselves and what belongs to Caesar, to Caesar. But if we are inscribed with the mark of God, who calls us to be in solidarity with those who are oppressed, those with empty pockets, we're called to fight for their needs and to accompany them through the dark night of the soul and beyond. And if we are inscribed with that mark, then let us give ourselves fully to God. Give to materialism and vanity what belongs to materialism and vanity, and give to God and God's people what belongs to God and God's people.